the spring of 1860, in the coastal marshlands surrounding Savannah, Georgia, a woman named Dinah became the center of a scandal so devastating that it would eventually consume an entire plantation, destroy two families, and leave a legacy of silence that the white families of Chatham County would spend generations trying to bury. What happened on the Weatherby plantation that year was not merely a tragedy. It was a grotesque manifestation of the moral rot at the heart of the slave system, a reminder that when human beings are reduced to property, the boundaries of depravity dissolve entirely. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slave-holding South. Stories that reveal the true cost of a system built on bondage and blood. The Weatherby plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of fertile bottomland along the Ogeechee River, its fields thick with rice and cotton that fed the insatiable appetite of the Savannah Cotton Exchange. Colonel Thomas Weatherby, 47 years old, had inherited the property from his father and expanded it through shrewd purchases and a calculated marriage to Constance Merriweather, daughter of a Charleston shipping magnate. The colonel was a man of education. He had studied law at the College of William and Mary, but he had abandoned the courtroom for the more lucrative business of agriculture. His library contained works of philosophy and theology, and he fancied himself a gentleman scholar, a man who could quote Cicero while calculating the market price of human flesh. He was tall, lean, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of cold, analytical eyes that could assess a field hand's worth in seconds. His wife, Constance, 39 years old, was a woman of rigid piety and social ambition, devoted to her standing in Savannah society and to the Presbyterian Church that ensured the moral life of the planter class. She had borne the colonel 3 children, all daughters, and the absence of a male gnawed at her like a wound that would not heal. The plantation was worked by approximately 230 enslaved men, women, and children. Among them, 8 men stood out for their particular skills and their position within the plantation hierarchy. There was Moses, 32, the head blacksmith, a man of powerful build and great dignity, who could repair anything made of metal and whose services were sometimes hired out to neighboring plantations. There was Samuel, 28, the cooper, who made the barrels that held the rice and cotton, a man with delicate hands and a thoughtful demeanor. There was Isaac, 26, a field driver, who supervised the other workers, strong and calculating, trusted by the colonel but resented by many of the enslaved for his willingness to wield the whip. There was Elijah, 35, the head stableman, who tended the colonel's priest horses and had a reputation for gentleness with animals. There was Benjamin, 24, a skilled carpenter who had built much of the plantation's outbuildings, a man who rarely spoke, but whose work was meticulous. There was Daniel, 29, a house servant who waited table and served the colonel's guests, educated enough to read and write, which made him both valuable and dangerous. There was Joshua, 23, a field hand known for his strength and his singing voice, which could be heard across the rice paddies at dawn. And there was Caleb, 31, another field driver, scarred from years of labor and punishment, who had learned to survive by reading the moods of white men and anticipating their cruelty. And then there was Dinah. Dinah was 26 years old in the spring of 1860, a woman of a striking presence, tall, with a skin the color of polished mahogany, and eyes that seemed to hold both defiance and resignation. She had been born on the plantation and had worked in the big house since she was a child, first as a maid and later, as Constance Weatherby's personal servant. She knew the rhythms of the household, the secrets whispered behind closed doors, the tensions that simmered beneath the surface of gente el southern life. She was intelligent, perceptive, and utterly trapped. She had borne 2 children, both light-skinned, both sold away before their 3rd birthdays, a fact that everyone on the plantation knew but no one spoke of openly. The grief of those losses had carved something hard and unyielding into her soul, the catalyst for what would become known simply as the Weatherby affair began in February of that year when Constance Weatherby discovered that she was once again not with child. She had consulted a physician in Savannah who had gently suggested that the problem might lie not with her, but with her husband, though such a diagnosis was never spoken aloud in polite society. The colonel, for his part, became increasingly withdrawn and irritable, spending more time in his study with his whiskey and his account books. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense, not merely for the continuation of the family name, but for the preservation of the plantation itself. Without a son, the property would be divided, diluted, lost to cousins or creditors. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and resentment that an idea took root in Colonel Weatherby's mind. The exact origin of this idea remains unclear, whether it came from some twisted interpretation of classical history, some rationalization drawn from the pseudo-scientific racial theories popular among the planter class, or simply from the unchecked power that allowed him to imagine any horror and make it real. What is known is that by late March, the colonel had formulated a plan that he presented to his wife in the privacy of their bedroom, a plan so shocking that Constance initially refused even to consider it. But desperation is a powerful force, and by the first week of April, she had agreed. The plan was this: Dinah would be compelled to live with each of the 8 men, Moses, Samuel, Isaac, Elijah, Benjamin, Daniel, Joshua, and Caleb, over the course of several weeks, in a controlled and ritualized manner, overseen by the colonel himself. The purpose, as the colonel explained it to his wife, was twofold. First, if Dinah became pregnant, the child would be raised in the big house as their own, claimed as the product of some distant cousin or charitable adoption, a solution to the rare problem that would preserve her appearances. Second, and perhaps more disturbing, the colonel seemed to believe that, by orchestrating this grotesque experiment, he could assert his total dominion over the bodies and souls of those he enslaved, could prove to himself that he was master not merely of their labor, but of their most intimate selves. Pause for a moment and reflect on the nature of absolute power. In a system where human beings were property, where a man could buy and sell, not merely a person's labor but their very flesh, their children, their future, is it any wonder that some slaveholders descended into depths of cruelty that defy comprehension? The Weatherby affair was not an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had already abandoned every principle of human dignity. The selection of the 8 men was not random. Each had been chosen for specific reasons: their skills, their positions, their perceived character. The colonel believed he was conducting a kind of experiment, testing bloodlines, assessing traits, playing God in a way that was facilitated by the legal and social structures of the slave-holding South. He recorded his observations in a leather-bound journal, noting dates, times, and his speculations about which men might produce the most suitable offspring. Dinah was informed of her role in early April. The conversation took place in the colonel's study, with Constance present but silent, her face a mask of rigid composure. Dinah, who had endured every conceivable indignity during her 26 years, who had learned to survive by swallowing her rage and grief, found herself facing something entirely new. This was not merely exploitation. It was orchestration, a deliberate theater of degradation. She was given no choice, of course. Refusal meant whip, meant being sold away, meant death. The colonel made this clear with the same calm precision he used when discussing crop yields or market prices. The encounters began in mid-April, orchestrated according to a schedule the colonel had devised. They took place in a small cabin near the edge of the property, a structure that had once hosted an overseer but now stood empty. The colonel was present for each encounter, positioned in an adjoining room where he could observe through a gap in the wall. The men were brought to the cabin one at a time, told only that they had been summoned by the master and that they must obey. Some understood immediately what was expected of them, others required more explicit instruction. All of them understood that refusal was impossible. Moses, the blacksmith, was the first. He entered the cabin with his head bowed, his powerful shoulders tense with confusion and shame. When he saw Dinah waiting there, saw the cold determination in her eyes, something unspoken passed between them, a shared recognition of their utter powerlessness. Samuel, the cooper, wept quietly afterward, his delicate hands trembling. Isaac, the field driver, approached the encounter with a kind of grim pragmatism, as though it were simply another task to be endured. Elijah, the stableman, spoke softly to Dinah throughout, as though trying to preserve some fragment of humanity in the midst of horror. Benjamin, the carpenter, remained utterly silent, his face a blank mask. Daniel, the house servant, seemed almost broken by the experience, his education making him perhaps more conscious of the full degradation of what was happening. Joshua, the singer, lost his voice for days afterward, unable to produce the songs that had once filled the rice fields. And Caleb, the scarred field driver, met Dinah's eyes only once, and in that glance was a universe of shared suffering. Throughout this period, life on the plantation continued its normal rhythms. The rice paddies were flooded and planted, the cotton fields prepared for the growing season. The colonel attended church services and business meetings in Savannah, his demeanor calm and authoritative. Constance presided over tea parties and charitable functions, her piety undiminished. To the outside world, the Weatherby plantation was a model of southern prosperity and order. But within the slave quarters, a different story was unfolding. Word of what was happening spread quickly, though in whispers and sidelong glances rather than open discussion. The enslaved community understood that this was something beyond the ordinary cruelties they endured. This was a violation of a different order. The 8 men became objects of pity and resentment, oscillated by the terrible knowledge of what had been done to them. Dinah moved through her days with a kind of mechanical efficiency, her face revealing nothing, her inner life sealed away where no one could touch it. If you find yourself deeply affected by these revelations from our nation's darkest chapter, consider subscribing to Shadows of the South so you might continue to bear witness to these forgotten testimonies, these stories that demand remembrance even as they pain us to recall. Late Mo, it became clear that Dinah was indeed pregnant. The colonel received this news with satisfaction, recording it in his journal with clinical detachment. Constance began to make preparations for the arrival of a child, ordering baby clothes from Charleston and converting one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery. The story they would tell, that they were adopting the child of a deceased cousin, was carefully constructed and rehearsed. But the house slaves knew the truth, and through them, the story began to leak into the wider community. This woman mentioned something to a shopkeeper's wife during a delivery to Savannah. A stable boy overheard a conversation and repeated it to a free black barber who served both black and white clients. The whispers reached the ears of other planters, of ministers, of the wives who controlled the social machinery of Savannah society. Consider how a society maintains its illusions. The slave-holding South depended not merely on violence, but on a vast conspiracy of silence, a collective agreement to ignore the evidence of horror that surrounded them on every side. But some violations were too grotesque even for that machinery of denial to process. The first crack in the Weatherby's facade came in early June, when Reverend Ashford Price of the First Presbyterian Church paid an unexpected visit to the plantation. The Reverend was a rotund man of 60, with white whiskers and a reputation for moral rectitude tempered by pragmatism. He had never preached abolition from his pulpit, never questioned the biblical justifications for slavery that his congregation required. But he had heard whispers, disturbing whispers, and he felt obligated to investigate. The colonel received in the parlor with bourbon and cigars, affecting his usual air of genteel authority. But Reverend Price was direct. He had heard certain rumors, he said, concerning irregularities on the plantation, rumors that reflected poorly on the colonel's Christian character and on the reputation of his family. The colonel initially attempted to dismiss these concerns as mere gossip, the jealous inventions of competitors. But the Reverend persisted, and eventually the colonel, perhaps sensing that denial was futile, offered a partial admission cloaked in euphemism and rationalization. He spoke of the pressures of maintaining a proper lineage, of the medical theories he had consulted, of the desperate measures that men of station sometimes found necessary. The Reverend listened in growing horror. When the colonel finished speaking, there was a long silence. Finally, Reverend Price stood, his face flushed with anger and disgust. He informed the colonel that what he had described was not merely a moral failing, but a sin of extraordinary magnitude, a perversion of the natural order that even the permissive morality of the slave-holding South could not countenance. He warned that if the story spread, and the word spread, he said, because such things always did, the Weatherbys would face social annihilation. The Reverend left without drinking his bourbon, without shaking the colonel's hand, and the colonel stood alone in his parlor, understanding perhaps for the first time the full magnitude of what he had set in motion. Within days, the story had exploded across Savannah society. It was discussed in hushed tones, in parlors and at dinner parties, dissected with a mixture of prurient fascination and genuine moral outrage. Some of the planters attempted to defend Weatherby, arguing that a man's conduct with his own property was his own concern. But others, particularly the women who controlled the social hierarchies, were implacable. Constance Weatherby found herself excluded from gatherings she had once commanded. Invitations ceased arriving. When she attended church, women turned their backs. The colonel, for his part, retreated into his study, drinking heavily and reading increasingly paranoid entries in his journal. He seemed unable to grasp how what he had considered a private matter of plantation management had become a public scandal. He ragged against the ingratitude of a society that had once celebrated him, against the hypocrisy of men who had themselves fathered mulatto children, but condemned him for his methods. In his darkest moments, he blamed Dinah, as though she had somehow orchestrated her own exploitation, as though her very existence had tempted him into sin. The 8 men, meanwhile, existed in a kind of limbo. They continued their work, but they were marked men now, their shame known throughout the plantation and beyond. Moses, the blacksmith, began to refuse food, his powerful frame slowly wasting away. Samuel, the cooper, was found one morning with his wrists slit, though he survived and was forced back to work. Isaac, the field driver, became increasingly brutal in his supervision, as though by inflicting pain on others he could somehow expiate his own degradation. The others withdrew into silence, became shadows, moving through the landscape of the plantation. Dinah carried her pregnancy with the same stoic silence she had maintained throughout the ordeal. She spoke to no one about what had happened, about what she felt. Her face remained a mask. The child she carried was not a source of hope or joy. It was simply another burden, another reminder of her powerlessness. In a society where even love was property, where intimacy itself was subject to the will of the master, where a woman's body belonged not to herself but to the man who held her title, is it any wonder that madness and despair were the inevitable outcomes? The Weatherby affair stripped away the gente, el venero of the plantation south, and revealed the naked brutality beneath. By July, the pressure had become unbearable. The cotton exchange in Savannah was refusing to deal with Weatherby's agents. His credit was being called in by banks that had previously considered him a solid investment. Neighbors who had once borrowed his equipment now returned it with curt notes, refusing further association. The social mechanisms that had sustained his wealth and status were systematically dismantling themselves. On the evening of July 19th, Colonel Thomas Weatherby locked himself in his study with his pistol and a bottle of whiskey. He spent several hours writing letters to his wife, to his daughters, to his brother in Charleston. The contents of these letters were never made fully public, but witnesses reported that they contained elaborate justifications for his actions, bitter complaints about the ingratitude and hypocrisy of his peers, and expressions of a kind of bewildered rage at how his life had collapsed so completely. Around midnight, a single shot rang out. The slaves working in the nearby kitchen heard it but did not investigate. It was Constance who found him an hour later, slumped over his desk, the leather journal open beside him, its pages spotted with blood. The death of Colonel Weatherby might have ended the story, but instead it triggered a cascade of further horrors. Constance, left with enormous debts and no malheur, was forced to sell the plantation and most of the enslaved people on it. The 8 men were sold to different buyers, scattered across Georgia and South Carolina, their fates largely unknown to history. Moses, the blacksmith, died within a year, some said of a broken spirit. Samuel survived long enough to see freedom in 1865, though he never spoke of his time on the Weatherby plantation. Of the others, the historical record is silent. Dinah gave birth in September 1860 to a boy. Constance had initially intended to keep the child, to raise him as her own in some diminished capacity, but the social stigma made this impossible. The child was sold to a slave trader when he was 3 months old, disappearing into the vast machinery of the domestic slave trade. Dinah herself was sold to a plantation in Mississippi, where she died in 1863, the cause of death recorded simply as fever. She was 30 years old. Constance Weatherby moved to Charleston to live with her brother, taking her 3 daughters with her. She never remarried, never regained her social standing. She spent her remaining years in a kind of genteel poverty, attending church services and maintaining a facade of respectability. But she was forever marked by the scandal. She died in 1872, and her obituary made no mention of her years in Savannah. The plantation itself was purchased by a consortium of investors who divided it into smaller parcels. The big house stood empty for several years before being torn down, its materials salvaged for other construction projects. By the time of the Civil War, it was as though the Weatherby plantation had never existed, its history carefully erased from the collective memory of Chatham County. But the story did not die entirely. Among the black community of Savannah, the tale of Dinah and the 8 men was preserved, passed down in whispers from generation to generation. It became a story about the depths of cruelty that the slave system enabled, about the particular horrors inflicted on black women, about the men who were forced to participate in their own degradation. It was a story about power and powerlessness, about the destruction of human dignity, about the moral corruption that slavery inflicted on everyone it touched. The Weatherby affair reveals several uncomfortable truths about the antebellum South. First, it demonstrates how the legal framework of slavery, which defined human beings as property subject to absolute control, created conditions where any imaginable horror could be rationalized and enacted. Second, it shows how even the social and religious structures that theoretically constrained behavior could be overwhelmed when faced with sufficiently extreme violations. Third, it illustrates the particular vulnerability of enslaved women, who faced not merely labor exploitation, but sexual exploitation as well, whose bodies were treated as instruments for the production of both wealth and heirs. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the story is how close it came to being lost entirely. If not for the persistence of memory within the black community, if not for the few scattered documents that survived in courthouse basements and church archives, the Weatherby affair would have vanished like thousands of other horrors, deliberately forgotten by those who benefited from the slave system and who had every reason to conceal its true nature. The silence that followed scandals like this was not accidental. It was essential to the functioning of slaveholding society. To acknowledge the full humanity of those they enslaved, to confront the true nature of what they were doing, would have made the entire system impossible to sustain. And so they chose amnesia, chose it to tell themselves comfortable lies about benevolent patriarchs and contented slaves, chose it to erase the stories that contradicted their myths. The legacy of Dinah and the 8 men extends beyond their immediate tragedy. The child born of that horrific spring was sold away and lost to history, but it was hardly alone. Thousands upon thousands of children were born under slavery, their parentage uncertain or deliberately obscured, their existence a living contradiction to the racial theories that supposedly justified their bondage. The light-skinned children, who appeared in slave quarters throughout the South, were testament to the systematic sexual exploitation that accompanied economic exploitation, a reality that white Southerners acknowledged in private while denying in public. For the 8 men involved, the psychological scars must have been profound. They were forced to participate in an act that violated not merely Dinah, but themselves, that stripped them of any illusion of dignity or autonomy. The slave system demanded not merely their labor, but their complicity in their own degradation, and the Weatherby affair represented an extreme version of that demand. That most of them did not survive long after these events, that they died young or broken or silent, speaks to the spiritual destruction that accompanied physical bondage. And for Dinah herself, a woman whose name was preserved, while so many others were forgotten, her story stands as a testament to the particular horrors faced by enslaved women. She endured not merely the initial violation, but the knowledge that any child she bore would be property, would be subject to the same system that had destroyed her. The two children sold away before the events of 1860, the third child sold away after. Each represented another loss, another wound that could never heal. The Weatherby plantation is gone now, its fields long since divided and developed, its history carefully sanitized in the tourist narratives of historic Savannah. There is no marker to commemorate what happened there, no museum exhibit explaining the true costs of the slave economy. The families who profited from the plantation's wealth, the Weatherbys and the Merriweathers, and all the others connected to them, have long since moved on, their contemporary descendants likely unaware of this chapter in their family history. This too is part of the legacy of slavery, not merely the violence and exploitation, but the determined forgetting, the erasure of uncomfortable truths. The stories reveal the price of power without accountability, of absolute authority over other human beings, of a society that chose profit over principle at every turn. They revealed the particular horrors inflicted on black women, whose bodies were treated as sites of both labor and reproductive exploitation, who faced violations that white women of the same era would have considered unimaginable. They revealed the destruction of black families, the systematic severing of bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters. They revealed the psychological torture inflicted on men who were forced to witness or participate in the violation of their loved ones, who were stripped of any ability to protect or defend. And ultimately, they revealed the bankruptcy of a social order that could produce such horrors, and then, having produced them, could attempt to erase them from memory, to rewrite history as though they had never happened, to construct a mythology of the Old South that bore no resemblance to the reality of plantation life. The silence that followed the Weatherby affair was not an accident. It was essential to maintaining the illusion that slavery was a benign institution, that enslaved people were contented with their lot, that the system was sustainable and even desirable. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful forces work to suppress it. The story of Dinah endured because the black community refused to let it die, because they essential that remembering these horrors was essential to honoring those who suffered them, essential to honoring those who suffered them, essential to understanding the full weight of what had been done to their ancestors. And in our own time, as we continue to grapple with the legacies of slavery, these stories remain urgently relevant. They challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths about our national history, to acknowledge the depths of the injustice that was perpetrated, and to recognize that the work of reckoning with that history is far from complete. The Weatherby affair stands as a testament to the human capacity for cruelty when unchecked by law or conscience, but also to the resilience of those who survived such horrors, who maintained their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Dinah's name survived when thousands of others did not because her suffering was unique, but because her story was so extreme that it could not be entirely silenced, so disturbing that it could not be entirely silenced, so disturbing that it demanded to be remembered even when others wanted to forget. In the end, this is why we return to these dark chapters of history, why we refuse to let them be buried beneath layers of comfortable myth and deliberate forgetting, not to wallow in horror for its own sake, not to condemn the present for the sins of the past, but to understand how we arrived at this moment, to recognize the ongoing impacts of historical injustice, and to commit ourselves to ensuring that such horrors are never repeated. The ghosts of the Weatherby plantation, like the ghosts of countless other seats of slavery's violence, demand our attention. They demand that we listen, that we remember, and that we reckon honestly with a past that shaped the world we inhabit today. If these stories from the darkest corners of American history have moved you to reflection, consider what other testimonies remain buried in courthouse records and family silences across the South. Join us here at Shadows of the South as we continue excavating these forgotten narratives, honoring the memories of those whose suffering the architects of the Old South tried so desperately to erase. Subscribe, reflect, and bear witness to the truth that history demands we face.